All right, good morning, everyone. I think everyone now is here from the waiting room. Welcome, everyone. I am not giving the official welcome. That will be Isabel de Siqueira. But I do, before she officially welcomes us, want to give a quick note about the simultaneous translation, because that would be important for those of you who want to be able to accompany the interventions, the provocations today in Portuguese. And also those of you who are watching on YouTube through the live stream on YouTube, unfortunately there is no simultaneous translation function on YouTube. If you need access to the simultaneous translation, we ask that you join us on Zoom because it's available here. So here are the instructions on simultaneous translation. First in Portuguese. O seminário conta com tradução simultânea, português e inglês, realizada por intérpretes em treinamento do curso de formação de intérpretes de conferências da PUC-Rio, André Cusero e Carolina Câmara. Agradecemos à equipe pela disposição e auxílio indispensável para a boa realização do evento. Para que a tradução corra bem, pedimos que façam suas falas e perguntas pausadamente. Caso você queira ativar a tradução, basta clicar no ícone de um globo na parte inferior à direita do Zoom e selecionar a língua para a qual precisa da tradução, assim como selecionar a opção desativar som original. Para voltar a ouvir os palestrantes na língua original, clique novamente no globo e selecione a opção Off. Agora em inglês. There is simultaneous translation between Portuguese and English for the seminar, enabled by the team of trainee interpreters from the Conference Interpreter Training Program of our University, PUC-Rio, namely André Cusero and Carolina Câmara. We thank the team for their availability and hard work, without which these encounters would be quite difficult. For the translation to work smoothly, we ask everyone to speak slowly. If you need to activate the translation, just click on the globe icon on the bottom right of your Zoom and select the language into which you need the translation. Then select Mute Original Audio. To get back to hearing the speakers in the original language, just click on the same globe and select Off. And now I turn over the floor, the virtual floor, to Isabel de Siqueira, so that she can welcome us on behalf of the Institute of International Relations, Instituto de Relações Internacionais of PUC-Rio.
Bom dia, obrigada, Jimmy. Bom dia a todas, bem-vindas, bem-vindos. Good morning, welcome everyone. Bom, a gente vai fazer essas boas-vindas oficiais em português, vocês já têm as instruções para a tradução. Como o Jimmy falou, eu sou Isabel Rocha de Siqueira, diretora adjunta do Instituto de Relações Internacionais, e em nome da direção do Instituto, na figura do professor Luiz Fernandes, que infelizmente não pôde estar conosco hoje, é uma honra dar as boas-vindas a todas e todas aqui presentes para a abertura do seminário A Vida Psíquica da Política Internacional. Eu quero, em primeiro lugar, dar parabéns à equipe organizadora do evento, a professora Paula Sandrin, os professores Jimmy Klausen e Paulo Chamon, do IRI, e a Lara Seles, da Universidade Federal de Uberlândia. Dar parabéns pela organização de um seminário que parece absolutamente importante para o tempo atual e que, claramente, como a gente vê pelo programa, convida a diálogos transversais e a pensar o próprio lugar que ocupamos como academia nesses tempos tão conturbados. Queria dar também parabéns à equipe de comunicação e de eventos do Instituto, que, mais uma vez, fez um trabalho irretocável, a coordenação da graduação, pelo cuidado com que lidera esse e tantos outros eventos. É importante ressaltar que o seminário de graduação desse semestre reflete fortemente a internacionalização do Instituto em diversas redes de pesquisa, bem como justamente o pluralismo teórico-metodológico que temos como valor central do trabalho do IRI. É com prazer que nesse seminário oferecemos a tradução simultânea, como o Jim explicou, que é uma prática comum no Instituto, mas pela primeira vez levada a cabo nesse contexto virtual. E para dar início a essa semana de diálogos, eu quero enfatizar também a importância da agenda de pesquisa dos professores e das professoras do IRI, organizadoras desse evento, olhando para o papel dos afetos na política internacional, para o apego ao capitalismo, os desafios do neoliberalismo, dos populismos atuais, dos nacionalismos, das catástrofes planetárias que vivemos nesse momento e, crucial, a dificuldade de pensar e praticar alternativas nesse contexto. É um momento de pesar no Brasil pelas vítimas dessa pandemia e das diversas crises que vivemos e, como sempre, esperamos que o IRI possa oferecer um espaço de diálogo plural, crítico e engajado, que a pesquisa, o ensino e a convivência, ainda que remota agora, guiem sempre as nossas conversas. É com muito prazer que recebemos, então, esse grupo de nomes tão importantes hoje para a disciplina e para pensarmos a política internacional atual diante de todo esse cenário. Eu quero agradecer, então, enormemente e dar as boas-vindas, especialmente às nossas convidadas e convidados, professores Ilan Kapoor, Francoise Vergès, Narendran Kumarakula, Rahul, Rodrigo Nunes, Agar Kotev, Yannis Stravakakis, Angela McRobbie, Naim Ianatula, Samu Tomshit, Débora Danovski, Robert Fletcher, Andrea Zevnik, Catarina Kinwall e Rosana Rocha Reis. Sem querer tomar tempo, então, dos diálogos riquíssimos que vamos ter essa semana, eu passo logo a palavra de volta para o Jimmy abrir os trabalhos. Obrigada e bons debates. Boa semana para todo mundo.
Thank you, Isabel. Isabel actually did us the service of mentioning all of the speakers whom we'll be welcoming this week. I just want to give a quick shout out to the other 4 panels. Nationalisms and populisms and insurgencies tomorrow, capital love on Wednesday, planetary catastrophe, denial and disavowal on Thursday, and desiring violence on Friday. Without further ado, I want to just jump into our panel because we have 5 very interesting speakers who will who give us a very decentered view, that is to say, non-Eurocentric view of the questions of emotions and affects and the psychic life of power in international politics. So I want to first introduce Ilan Kapoor, who will give us his 10-minute provocation. Ilan Kapoor is a professor of critical development studies at the Faculty of Environmental Studies, York University. He teaches in the area of global development and environmental politics, and his research focuses on post-colonial theory and politics, participatory development and democracy, and more recently, ideology critique. His geographic areas of interest include South Asia, especially India and Pakistan. He is the author of The Post-Colonial Politics of Development, Routledge 2008, and Celebrity Humanitarianism, The Ideology of Global Charity, Routledge 2013. His new book is entitled Confronting Desire, Psychoanalysis and International Development. Thank you, Ilan.
Thank you very, very much. Muito obrigado. Can you hear me, by the way? Yes, okay, good. So let me say that it's always such a pleasure to be part of any event organized by PUC-Rio. So thanks very much to Paulino, Laura, Paula, Jimmy, and all the behind-the-scenes people for inviting me and the panelists and putting together this wonderful event. So I'm going to speak briefly about the role of psychoanalysis, mainly as it applies to my own field, which is international development studies. Because I think that mainstream development studies sees itself as a kind of rational science where policy decisions about, say, poverty or women's empowerment or environmental conservation are based on reason and logic. Yeah, you do a needs assessment, you weigh that against the resources available and so on, and then you devise a policy or strategy aimed at poverty alleviation. I claim that what this rational approach hides, what it disavows and ignores, is the whole realm of the unconscious desires. What poverty alleviation policy making hides, for example, are a whole host of irrational desires that often accompany it. So the thrill and recognition, the feeling of beneficence one gets from helping and saving the other. The envy one feels of those who are better or more powerful than oneself. The disgust and obscene racial hatred that some feel for those they consider inferior or less developed. The enjoyment, often the sadomasochistic enjoyment one takes in being superior to the other, dominating the other, supervising the other, disciplining the other. So whereas development purports to be obeying a logic of reason and science, psychoanalysis shows how there is a different process, a different logic at play. Desires follow a logic of enjoyability, excess, self-destruction even, rather than rationality, effectiveness, or humanitarianism. Psychoanalysis points, in other words, to the irrational core of development. And that's probably why development studies has tended to ignore the whole realm of desire and passion and emotions. There has been a relative silence on the topic. Partly, I think this neglect is attributable to the belief by social science disciplines generally, precisely in the rational and empirical, taking seriously only that which is logical, which we can measure, which we can quantify, while disparaging, while looking down upon the emotional, the qualitative, and especially the unpredictable. But partly I would venture to say that development's relative silence on psychoanalysis is itself psychoanalytically telling, because it betrays a suspicion of human passions. Why? Precisely because unconscious desires run in contradiction to rationality, as I've been saying. As they say jokingly, psychoanalysis is about when you say one thing, but you actually mean your mother or your father. Our unconscious desires destabilize and alienate the rational subject, divide our social identity, and thus endanger development's projects, intentions, aspirations, policies, strategies. Yet such resistance is revealing precisely of development's unconscious, of its inability or unwillingness to confront the threat of its own desires. So let me illustrate some of this with the help of a key Lacanian psychoanalytic concept, jouissance, translated in English as enjoyment. Enjoyment refers not just to the pleasure we derive from things, but rather the excessive satisfaction, the orgasmic pleasure, which is true to the French translation, the orgasmic pleasure, the kick we get from doing something irrational, counterproductive, or even wrong. So enjoyment helps explain, for example, such self-destructive pursuits as smoking and binge drinking, or such extreme sports as bungee jumping and free diving. People do them not despite the fact that they are dangerous, but because they are dangerous. So jouissance is a kind of unconscious idiotic stupor. I like the word idiotic stupor, that often makes us ask for more, even though we well know the problems and risks. So now let me provide a couple of concrete examples. The first concerns the emphatically capitalist orientation of development. Despite the fact that capitalism has been severely criticized, we know well that it results in socioeconomic inequality, in global unevenness, in ecological destruction. Despite that, it is very much in the ascendancy today. Arguably, it constitutes the only available economic horizon today, whether in the global north or south. And one of the key reasons for such tremendous success is, I would claim, jouissance. That is to say, many people enjoy, indeed love capitalism. Right? And in fact, on Wednesday, as was just mentioned, there's going to be a panel precisely on capital love as part of this seminar series. We are libidinally bound to capitalism because we get so much from it. Cars, TVs, houses, nice clothes, cheap fast food, iPhones, and so on. And capitalism, especially in its latest neoliberal phase, has been very effective in appealing to our passions. It's able to exploit what Lacanians see as a deep-seated sense of loss and lack, enabling us to fill such lack through consumerism and materialism. This is why late capitalist societies, whether in the West or the global South, are characterized by the normalization of excess, the desire for the best, the biggest, the tallest, the richest, the most original, the pervasiveness of supersized everything, from dams and buildings to coffee and burgers, the orgiastic show of wealth, or the overabundance of choice, whether in TV channels or music or indeed university programs. The problem, however, is that although capitalist development promises enjoyment, it never quite delivers. A Coke doesn't quite quench. More wealth is never enough. And supersized fast food sickens rather than satisfies. But I think this failure is written into the very logic of capitalism. Because if an end to dissatisfaction were possible, that would spell the end of the global capitalist system. Instead, the aim of the system is always to solicit and activate desire, but never allow it to be satisfied. That's what enables ever-increasing growth, profit, or market share. So capitalist development in this sense is driven by insatiable lack. So that try as we may to satisfy our enjoyment, we always miss the mark. The second illustration, and I'll be very brief and end, the second illustration of jouissance concerns nationalism. And again, tomorrow, as was just mentioned, there's going to be a panel on the question of nationalism and populism. Little else, I think, has been more enduring than national identifications in the development context. Appeals to national bonds were, of course, crucial during the independence struggles across the former colonies, but they have also been a key ingredient in post-independence national politics to help unify the nation on key political issues, such as, say, land reform or industrialization or liberalization strategies, or PET or prestige development projects and so forth. What's notable is that these appeals have invariably relied not so much on rational arguments as on social passions. Nationalism operates at the libidinal level, that is, at the level of our guts, our hearts, our affect. It engages our sense of belonging, community, and pride. It relies on the phantasmatic promise of full enjoyment, which once again helps explain the secret of its persistence and its success, something that the great Françoise warned about in his scathing critique of the national bourgeoisie. Maybe Françoise will be talking about that in a bit. But there is a sinister dimension to nationalism, its tendency to scapegoat, visible, for example, in the current neo-populist nationalist politics of Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, Orban, or Trump. This is the tendency that arises as part of the very formation of national identity. To construct the nation is appeal to what makes us unique. It is this uniqueness that provides people with an ecstatic sense of unity and togetherness. That's jouissance. Yet, as Lacanians are quick to point out, such togetherness is a fiction, masking the lack and instability at the heart of any identity. And so usually when things go wrong and the sense of national togetherness is threatened, say by economic crises or recessions or internal political stability, like a lost election, for example, in the United States, usually when that happens, a scapegoat is constructed. Fundamentalists who terrorize us, the poor who threaten our security, immigrants who steal our jobs or menace our women, the Jews, Indians, Chinese who plot to rule the world, right? It is such scapegoating that allows the nation to avoid confronting, that is to displace its own inadequacies or contradictions by projecting them onto a stereotypical other. So the obscene thing we have to ponder here, and this is my concluding point, the obscene thing we have to ponder here is that racism, racist nationalism is founded on enjoyment. People get a libidinal kick out of racism, which would help explain why it is so pervasive throughout the world, despite decades of anti-racist education. So what I'm suggesting is that anti-racist education does not and cannot adequately address the problem, because the problem is not merely one of knowledge, of raising awareness, but of coming to terms with, of facing our desires and our perverse enjoyment, idiotic enjoyment, stupor, as I said earlier. The challenge then becomes one of reorienting our desires. And I point out in my latest book, for example, that this is the type of work being done by such movements as BLM or Idle No More or Dalit movements in India. It's not just a question of public education, but of construction of new fantasies. The point is not simply to increase awareness, but to undercut and rework dominant fantasies, of white supremacy, for example, as a way of reordering our desires. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Just a quick note for the speakers. Ilan kept within the 10 minutes, just so that we can make sure to have time for question and answer. I might signal, I might try to signal when you have 2 minutes left, but hopefully everyone will be attentive to their time. And also something I didn't mention at the beginning is I have to thank not only the team at IRI, who always puts on these seminars with such excellent work, with so few hiccups, but also my fellow organizers, Paolo Chamon, Paula Sandrin, and Laura Salas. We started this conversation so long ago in 2019 on this, and it's so pleasing to see that this is coming to fruition now, and that there's so many people interested that actually we've filled up the maximum room on or virtual room on Zoom, so people are pushed onto YouTube whether they like it or not. I'm not sure which one I would choose if I had to, but because, you know, let's think about the virtualization of capital in these pandemic times. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome Françoise Regis. Françoise Regis is an active teacher, scholar, and curator. She has recently published The Wombs of Women, which is translated into English and by Duke University Press in 2020, and hopefully we can get it published into translated into Portuguese as well. Her book Decolonial Feminism has in fact been translated into Portuguese. I don't remember now the publisher. But in any case, her work is available in Portuguese and English as well as French. She's a specialist in post-colonial studies. Vergès was chair of Global Souths at the Collège Études Mondiales in Paris. Currently, she is the president of the collective Decolonize the Arts. And her areas of research are post-colonial studies, South-South exchanges, coloniality, and feminism. She has published many works and articles in French and in English on slavery remembrance, colonial psychiatry, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, the economy of predation and globalization, the post-colonial museum, and the processes of creolization in Indian Ocean communities. She is also the author of documentary films on Maryse Condé and Aimé Césaire, and she was project advisor for Documenta 11 in 2002 and the Triennale de Paris in 2011. Françoise.
Well, thank you so much. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone, or good evening, I don't know where you are. So, okay. I want to look at two structures of affect and desire, which are both driven by a libidinal energy around inflicting death and taking death as a source of pleasure and completeness, and by toxic masculinity. All have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So the pleasure that domination gives, you know, torture, feminicide, rape, murder, humiliation. And within that structure, you know, I want to look also at rape and private property. The rape not just being an act of male domination, but an act which is inseparable from the law of private property and the mandate of masculinity, as Rita Segato has called them, that connect whiteness, heteropatriarchy and maleness, and the bioeconomy of extraction and exhaustion that characterize racial capitalism and its need to inflict death to survive. So the pleasure that domination gives, you know, I take the master house, the world it made and which made it, and upon which it depended at my point of departure. I'm not suggesting an unchanged spatial and cultural arrangement, but the existence of a form, of an architecture, of a structure that connect different nodes of power and whose accumulation of wealth was based on the economy of extraction and exhaustion. It is a world that produced enormous amount of suffering, enormous amount of wasted land and wasted lives. And its power rests on pacification, neutralization, and terror. The interdiction to make kinship, to make communities and families outside of the heteronormative and patriarchal norms. And it was left behind wounds, trauma, distress and dread, and mental suffering that lasts through generation, as well as tons of junk whose polluting capacity lingers also for generation. Its laws of protection of women and children enforce the division between those who deserve protection and those who do not. Today, it means also looking at the laws, ideology, tools, and structures that are necessary still for its survival and at the afterlife of slavery. The pleasure that domination gives is the intense gratification provided by the ritual of humiliation, not necessarily, of the visible, but even the daily small ritual of humiliation, not the tip of the iceberg, but everything that is also below. By the right to terrorize, to kill, to rape, to steal, to loot, and let die. Domination feeds the elated sentiment that there exist no borders, no limit to one's own power. It feeds a delirium of no omnipotence, or rather, a delusional omnipotence. It can be described as narcissistic intoxication, the demonstration of absolute possession that sealed the megalomaniac idea of possessing the universe. The grip must be absolute, excessive. It is hybris, but it also needs a public. It needs to be seen, to be exhibited. The goal is a total triumph of the subject over what it has made into an object, which results in the object being attacked and gradually degraded to be finally stripped of all its essential characteristics, which individualize it, and become an anonymous substance without existence of its own, a piece of trash. Its raison d'être is to proclaim that all that is as meaning obeys no order, follows no goal, depends only on the power that it can exercise to impose its will on the object of his appetite. And I see colonial slavery as a matrix of this world, the idea of, the absolute domination of the master, and the plantation as the place, as a structure, the matrix of this structure. His word, to paraphrase, Freud, consisting in establishing an unfeeling long line of murderers who claim that killing advanced civilization. It was structural and systemic violence. Its history is the history of the organization of a global scale of extraction and exhaustion, which is still depleting the life force and energy of billions of people in the global south. Its wealth and capital accumulation are based on the extraction and exhaustion of gold and of mine of gold and silver and labor in the factory, in the mine, in the plantation. But since racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and imperialism are unable to stop the economy of predation, devastation, extraction, and exhaustion, because it is the very foundation of their survival, since colonization is their organizing principle and dispossession, privatization of land, water, and air, and commodification, their ways of extending their power, since nothing must escape their unsatisfied appetite for domination, for the pleasure of inflicting pain, their unsatisfied appetite for appropriation of object, notion, narrative, image, and concept, we must also live in dream of futurity. Whiteness has become the ideal object of love for everyone, as also, Ilan was saying, as front finance, as warners, racial as subject has also invited into the realm of violence to manage the subaltern, and the national bourgeoisie will follow, Fanon said, the Western bourgeoisie along its path of negation and decadence. So my second point on rape, because I need to move. Dismembered woman's body thrown in garbage dump in Mexico illustrate the connection patriarchy and gore capitalism are making between female bodies and garbage. The process, this is the, how the colonial genealogy of cis masculinity, which legitimizes a performative collective masculinity through the process that make, the rape and murder of a girl as inevitable. Rape is a tool of domination. It is a message between men, but it's also tied to racial capitalism and to what Achille Mbembe has called brutalism. Rape must have a public, Men must do it in front of other men in a collective ceremony of sadism and exhibition of manhood. The body of the activist, of the indigenous woman, of the Black woman, of the trans, queer, gay, of the sex worker must live under the constant threat of rape. Rape is a disciplining tool of racial capitalism. It belonged to its history, you know, the rape of enslaved women. It is a banal weapon for the armies. It is pervasive still in plantation and the workplace for racialized female body. But rape also feminized bodies. It makes them into surface whose whole must be brutalized with guns, bottle, piece of wood, and penis. Rape has also become a weapon because it feminized body against Black and brown male body, increasingly feminized by the police and the army to become the object of rape, as we have seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Congo, and elsewhere. In the US itself, you know, the Center for Control of Disease reported in 2010 that nearly one in 71 men, have been raped or had an experience of attempted rape. I'm not pleading for making rape gender neutral. Absolutely, men rape. I suggest to look at rape as one tool of dehumanization and power, as as expressing the anxiety, you know, for, you know, the body of wholes, you know, for the desire for sealed surfaces. Rape, often followed by murder, is the expression of private property, which transforms its target, whether, you know, we call also the rape of land, you know, but rape of body, into object for use and abuse. Rape transforms body into waste, connecting rape and capitalism, because capitalism is also the production of waste. So a leap of imagination is really needed, you know, for me to go out of that, even, you know, in terms of psychoanalysis, of course, you know. How can we tell our story through the language of oppression? What kind of cure must we invent and develop? Aimé Césaire wrote that we need to invent sound, new sounds. To invent and nurture collective and self-repair, we must work also with the entangled temporality of decolonial cure and repair, of the past, which has been barely repaired, whose repair is still going on the century of accumulated wound on the planet, the people, the animal and plants, you know, repairing the open vein of the planet that the economy of extraction and exhaustion leaves behind, the ruins, the wasted body and wasted land. We also have the temporality of the present and its politic of imminent death and destruction. And the future, since we know that past and current destruction are already threatening the life of future generation. We know that children in the global south and in minority in the global north will have no childhood, that around the world, children are criminalized, treated like adults, condemned at birth to premature death, to be criminalized and treated like adults, because the right to childhood is not a universal right. The process of enchilding, as Palestinian legal scholar Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian has described, is the understanding of children as political capital in the hand of those in power. The political work of violence designed to create, direct, govern, transform, and construct colonized children as dangerous, racialized order, enabling their eviction from the realm of childhood itself. Calling up to individual restraint is worthless. It reflects the Western belief that we are governed by reason, and also what Ilan Kapoor was just saying just before. We never exist outside of the social, and the social either give us the right to dominate or to hinder. International laws and ideology were necessary for the survival of the master house and legitimate its domination, and domination depended on the privatization and militarization of land and water, and they were carefully organized by European power. The international community, as we call it, and its law cannot stop the regime of violence and death, making, because the global system has been founded on absolute power, on extraction. Healing cannot be achieved by using the master tool. It is about collective care, self-repair, and collective repair, but also about dreams of futurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Françoise. I should say quickly, it's a great pleasure to see Françoise again. We both studied in Berkeley, and I saw her many years ago. I think the last time that I saw Françoise was over a decade ago. But anyway, we now go to Narendran Kumarakula. Just a reminder that Naren has actually asked us to pause the recording on the Zoom. So let's make sure to do that. Naren is adjunct professor in the Peace and Conflict Studies program at the University of Waterloo and associate editor of the Journal of Narrative Politics. He holds a PhD in international relations from the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. His work explores the world-making capacities of marginalized actors in contexts of massive violence. He recently co-edited a book entitled Violence and Ordering of the Third World, an Introduction, Routledge 2019, and published many articles on decolonization, political orders, gender, indigeneity, and indigeneity. He has also put together a special issue in 2017, if I recall correctly, of the Journal of the Institute, of our Institute of IRI, Contexto Internacional, on decolonial temporalities. His research interests include political violence, global justice, colonialism and decolonization, post-colonial nationalism, food sovereignty, and narrative writing. I turn it over to you, Naren. Thank you. That absorbing narrative. So now we move on to the intervention or provocation of Rahul Rao. Rahul Rao is a senior lecturer in politics at SOAS London, SOAS University of London. He is the author of Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Post-Coloniality, 2020, and Third World Protest Between Home and the World of 2010, both published by Oxford University Press. He's currently writing a book on the politics of controversial statues. He's a member of the Radical Philosophy Collective and blogs occasionally at The Disorder of Things. He has research interests in international relations, post-colonial and queer theory, gender and sexuality, and South Asia. I turn it over to you, Rahul.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thanks to all the organizers at PUC-Rio. It's a pleasure to be here and to listen to my fellow panelists who I've already taken so much from. For the last 5 years, I've been thinking about writing a book which, quite independently of the title of this panel, I have tentatively been calling The Psychic Lives of Statues. And so this is what I want to talk to you about briefly in the 10 minutes that I have. I started thinking about this in 2015 when Rhodes Must Fall erupted in Cape Town. And as you know, this is a movement that then inspired an analogous movement by the same name in the United Kingdom at the University of Oxford, which has in turn had wider reverberations in the movement for the decolonization of the academy in the UK and elsewhere. Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa also inspired Gandhi Must Fall in Ghana, and was also referred to by protesters against Confederate statues in the United States. Those protests, of course, have been long running for several decades, but underwent a kind of spurt in 2015 after a white supremacist named Dylan Roof murdered 9 African Americans in a church in South Carolina. And then, of course, last year, in the summer of last year, in the middle of the, well, we are still very much in the COVID pandemic in many different parts of the world, so it's hard to think of the beginning or the middle of much less the end. But in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, of course, set off another spate of statue removals. In the UK, the statue of Colston in Bristol came down through direct action after many years of protesters trying to follow the proper channels of municipal lobbying and so forth. And it seems that at the University of Oxford, the college that has for many years, many decades, hosted the statue of Cecil Rhodes seems to be undergoing a change of heart. So change is in the air. And so many statues have come down recently, not just in the UK and the US, but in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in New Zealand, and in places too numerous to count, that perhaps it is not too optimistic to say that even if it will take time to decide what to do with them, the era of colonial statues may be over. At the same time, statues are being built on ever more monumental scales in a country like India, where one might look at the statues built by the Dalit movement over several decades, which the Hindu right now seeks to imitate, rival, and surpass. The tallest statue in the world currently stands in India, in the state of Gujarat, which is the home state of the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. These monumental statues one might think of as expressions of the jouissance that Ilan Kapoor was talking about, although I would suggest that we have to think very differently about the statues of the Dalit movement and the statues of the Hindu right. And perhaps we can have a conversation about who needs statues and who does not in the public sphere. What I want to think about is less the wider significance and reverberations of these movements, which are of course very important to talk about. I want to come back to the statue itself, because I think that in many of our discussions about the politics of statues, we tend to give the statues short shrift. And I noticed this right at the inception of Rhodes Must Fall, where one of the paradoxes of arguments about statues is that despite the considerable heat that they generate, the statue itself is regarded as ephemeral, or at best a device through which to provoke a conversation about something that is supposedly more important. So when the Rhodes Must Fall protests erupted in the UK, even commentators who were sympathetic to its demands were quick to relegate questions about the future of the statue to the sidelines. To give you a few examples, Amit Chowdhury, writing in The Guardian, thought it would be unfortunate if the movement became identified with the statue in Oriel College, because he regarded its wider ambitions around the decolonization of the curriculum, of the student staff demographics, etc., to be more significant. David Olusoga, one of Britain's most well-known public historians, worried that by building their manifestos around calls for the taking down of statues, decolonization campaigns had distorted complex and worthy ideas into a simple right-wrong, yes-no statue debate. His writing more recently, I think, expresses a much more candid admiration for what protesters did in Bristol around the Colston statues. So I recognize that people's views on this issue have shifted. Amiya Srinivasan, writing in the London Review of Books, wrote that complaints of structural racism and calls for curriculum reform do not draw public attention like the toppling of a statue, and the Rhodes Must Fall leaders know this. And even Rhodes Must Fall Oxford felt compelled to point out, perhaps somewhat defensively, that its campaign is about more than a statue, while nonetheless insisting that statues and symbols matter because they are a means through which communities express their values. Now, this caution is well advised because to focus on the statue as an end in itself risks diverting attention from the material redistributions of power that movements against racism seek. And we saw the dangers of this last summer, where the Conservative government in the UK was much more interested in talking about statues and in protecting statues than in thinking about the wider manifestations of structural racism in the UK, which of course it is heavily invested in denying, when it comes to things like prisons or immigration detention or Brexit or the policy on migration and so on and so forth. And yet to write off statues as a distraction from these more significant material issues, or at best a clever tactical route into them, begs questions about why they are built and about the psychic and affective investments of both those who defend the statues and those who attack them. Many of the statues that were brought down recently through popular direct action were subject to a variety of symbolically punitive treatments, including strangulation, beheading, burning, and drowning. Protesters noted with satisfaction that in being thrown into the waters of Bristol Harbour, the statue of Colston was being made to suffer the fate of thousands of the Africans he had enslaved, who did not survive the Middle Passage. On Juneteenth, the holiday that marks the belated announcement in 1865 of the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas, 2 statues of Confederate soldiers were torn down at the state capitol at Raleigh, North Carolina. One was hung from a lamppost, while the other was dragged down a street and placed in front of the courthouse. So when we dismiss arguments about statues as a means to some other more important end, I think we cannot make sense of the passion and the vitriol and violence that defenders and opponents of statues bring to bear on these objects through practices of veneration, commemoration, maintenance, vandalism, defacement, and mockery. I think we fail to take iconography seriously as a potential site of identity, injury, and repair. You might say we fail to take the psychic lives of statues seriously. Now, in many ways, it's the very publicness of statues that makes them available for these kinds of psychosocial investments. We often describe statues as phallic objects, and I think we do that for reasons that go beyond obvious considerations of their shape or the fact that they disproportionately depict men, which of course they do. Typically built to endure, a statue is a bid for immortality. And placed at the center of the agora, the public square, the statue demands attention, whereas virtually every other medium of visual representation, think of a book, a film, a play, or a painting, all of these things require an approach from the reader or viewer. Statues do not need our consent to thrust themselves upon us. At the same time, like the phallus, statues are vulnerable because they typically stand alone and unguarded, exposed in the public square. So they're peculiar in the sense that they are simultaneously aggressive and insecure. And this, I think, allows them to lend themselves to becoming lightning rods for public discontent. This vulnerability also makes statues available for popular reinscription and challenge in a way that other terrains of history are not. A well-placed piece of graffiti, and I'm thinking here of the graffiti that was scrawled on the statue of Churchill in the recent protests in Westminster Square, was a racist, were the words that were scribbled on the statue, arousing the intense antipathy of the far right, who then gathered in a counter-mobilization to defend these statues, leading the mayor of London and the local administration to board up the statues. Which is a third sort of attitude, I think, towards what should be done with these things. A piece of graffiti, like a Me Too tweet, can sometimes dislodge the weight of received wisdom more effectively than the most painstaking and intrepid scholarship that we as academics and historians are invested in producing. Maybe let me just say, by way of an interim conclusion, and I won't go on for much longer, that even as we attend to the psychic attachments and investments of statues, I don't want to lose sight of the material reference in these struggles, the material connections to structural racism between these figures and statues. Statues of historical figures with complex and unsavory pasts surround us, yet only a tiny minority attract attention, let alone controversy. Statues leap into significance only when someone is able to tell a persuasive story, connecting them to some pressing contemporary, usually material concern, an instance of violence, the institutional racism of police or healthcare or universities or something else. So far from simply inverting the conventionally posited relationship between the material and the symbolic, I think a theory of statues that could tell us something useful about when and why statues begin to mean something to the public has to be attentive to the traffic between the material and the symbolic. So to reiterate, I'm not simply saying, let's pay more attention to the symbolic, the psychic than the material. I'm trying to get us to think about the bi-directional relationship between the material and the psychic that is at work in these moments of controversy and contestation. I'll stop here.
Wonderful, thank you, Rahul. Our last provocateur for today is, of course, you question, when you all ask your questions, that can also be provocation, so I don't mean to suggest that only the panelists can provoke us, but the last scheduled provocateur is Rodrigo Nunes. He is a professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the philosophy department of our university, PUC-Rio. He is the author of Organization of the Organizationless, Collective Action After Networks, published by Mute/PML Books in 2014, and also of the book Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, which will be out this month with Verso Books. He's also the author of several articles in such journals as Le Temps Moderne, Radical Philosophy, Crisis and Critique, International Journal of Communication, Serrote, and South Atlantic Quarterly. More recently, he organized a dossier on Brazil under Bolsonaro for radical philosophy. He was a visiting lecturer at Goldsmiths College, University of London, and the University of East London, as well as visiting researcher at Brown University. His research interests include the ontological turn in contemporary philosophy and anthropology, cybernetics and system theory, theories of trans-individuality and the role of affects in politics, self-organization and the question of political organization, the problem of immanence and perspectivism. I turn it over to you, Rodrigo. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Eu começo pedindo desculpas por não falar em português, mas eu combinei com os organizadores falar em inglês. So now I switch back to English, and I'd like to start by thanking Jimmy and my other colleagues at the Institute of International Relations, the organizers of this event, Paulinho, Lara. It's a pleasure to be taking part in such an interesting and timely event, and an honor to be sharing it with my co-panelists today and tomorrow, and all the other people who will be speaking during these days. I suspect that for a long time, when people thought about the relationship, or people tried to think about the relationship between affect and international politics, the usual approach was to think of affect as determining international politics indirectly, i.e. by determining changes in domestic politics. So the root would be changes in domestic mood, changes in domestic politics, changes in international politics, which in turn could, of course, impact domestic mood and so on. I think this scheme, which is obviously still applicable in many cases, is nevertheless a remnant from another time that fails to take into account two of the defining features of our age. The first of these is the tightening of communicational circuits and feedback loops across borders, made possible by the growing ubiquity of media in our living environment, and particularly in recent years of social media. This process not only magnifies how fast and how far information and affect can travel around the world, but it creates a potential for effective synchronization at a scale unknown in the history of humankind. So whereas Gabriel Tard once saw the publics created by mass media as gradually replacing the crowds of the 19th century, today we find in what Manuel Castells called the mass self-communication of publics, connected ever more intensely across ever greater distances, the same potential for contagion, and obviously also occasionally for irrationality, that Gustave Le Bon identified with the physically contiguous crowd in the 19th century. The second feature is the emergence of the planet itself as a political question, one that evidently still largely depends on nation states to become operational, but which nonetheless presents itself as a problem that affects people living in all countries indistinctly, even if not equally, and which demands to be approached from a supranational perspective. I'm referring, of course, here primarily to climate change. So what I would like to discuss here today is how these two factors, and particularly the second, impact the psychic life of international politics today. In recent years, we have seen a wave of far-right leaders in places like Brazil, India, and the US, several others, rise to power on the back of highly mobilized social bases, often radicalized by campaigns of misinformation and a savvy use of social media. And the accounts of these phenomena tend to focus on 2 points. First, misinformation itself and how far the far right has weaponized our contemporary media ecology to spread narratives that sharpen and take advantage of existing political polarization. And second, the fact that the far-right's success must also be understood to a large extent as a displacement or reorientation of anti-systemic sentiments that have risen sharply all over the world since the global financial crisis began in 2007. In short, people were angry and disoriented, and the far right was in the right place at the right time and had the stories to tell them who to blame and what to do. What I would like to suggest is that there is more to the efficacy of the stories that the far right tells than being in the right place at the right time, or the fact that they are especially well suited to exploit the architecture of social media and the prevalent mood of institutional discredit. Faced with the fact that so many people today build strong political identities around narratives that often strike us as frankly absurd, the question we need to be asking ourselves, I think, is what needs do these stories meet? Some of these are immediately obvious. We know that conspiracy theories offer the cognitive comfort of clarity and complexity. We know about the psychological rewards that come with feeling part of something, seeing what most others fail to see, finding comrades in arms, or being on the right side of history. The thing is, all of this could apply not just to the stories that the far right tells, but to any other account of what is wrong with the world today. So why do their narratives specifically have the power of interpolation that they have been shown to have? My hypothesis is that far-right discourse has drawn much of its efficacy from the fact that it speaks to the atmospheric dread of a world haunted by climate change, a stagnating economy, precarization, the lack of democratic oversight, and global pandemics much better than mainstream political discourse has done. In other words, far-right discourse acknowledges the real state of the world more truthfully than most well-meaning centrists do, but with a catch. It does so by fabulating much simpler versions of these real problems with much simpler solutions. And this is what allows it to address the anger and frustration of its adherents, while also meeting the unconscious need to continue to disavow the increasingly inescapable magnitude of the challenges facing us today. My intuition here is that being in denial, i.e. the unconscious attempt to protect oneself from a traumatic experience or thought by refusing to recognize its reality, or what Freud called Verleugnung, and is usually translated in English as disavowal, creates a demand for the commodity that conscious denialists, those who knowingly and deliberately lie when denying climate change, COVID, or the real causes of economic inequality, for instance, supply. So if there's a booming market for the latter, there's a booming market for denialist narratives, we should expect that there is an upturn of the former, of disavowal. The success of the far-fetched narrative that the far right tells can thus be partially explained by the fact that they at once acknowledge people's diffused sense of living in an age of diminishing expectations, and at the same time minimize how deep the causes for this condition are and how much would have to change to really address it. This then allows us to connect that planetary condition that I discussed earlier, i.e. climate change, to what is perhaps the most important development in international politics in recent years, i.e. the rise of the far right. And we can do that, I think, by situating climate change at the source of one of the pervasive moods of our time. Namely, the fact that the need to disavow increasingly traumatic real conditions of existence, and above all, the looming threat of climate change, generates a flight into the imaginary that can become ever more divorced from reality, the harder that disavowal becomes. And this is what finally can seal an alliance between those gearing up for surviving in worsening conditions and an elite that appears to be increasingly at ease with the idea that, as Bruno Latour put it, the earth no longer has room enough for them and for everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I wasn't sure if you were about to make another point. I thank all of our 5 provocateurs for today. So far, we have 2 questions from the audience. Again, I encourage not only those of you in the audience to send in your questions, but also our panelists can, of course, engage with each other, and that would be fun as well, because it's nice to have so many smart people in the same virtual room and talking on overlapping questions. So the first question that has come in is specifically to Ilan, Kapoor. And the question is from Isabel Siqueira, of my colleague at IRI, PUC-Rio. And she asks the following: what does the notion of irrational in a psychoanalytic understanding do to the role the irrational has historically played in defining the lack, the absence, and the needs of the so-called underdeveloped, of those who live close to nature and do not explore it, and what's the other translation of exploração? Exploit it in its full potential, that is, for destruction and consumption. How can these notions of the irrational be thought together if they can? So the irrational of capitalism, and then of course the irrational of the objects of predation, who are not rationally exploiting nature. The second question that has come in is for Françoise Vergès. It's from Clarisse Schreiner. Françoise, could you tell us about the role of art in resisting hegemonic narratives? How powerful is this mobilization, and in what ways can we use this against oppressive powers in an inclusive manner? Thank you all for the presentations. It's an amazing moment we're having. So first, Ilan.
Okay, great, thanks. It's lovely, great, wonderful to hear my colleagues speaking as well. And I have so many questions for them too. But maybe we can engage in those later. But in terms of the question asked specific to me, I mean, the thing to remember, I think, about psychoanalysis, at least the Lacanian variant of psychoanalysis, is that the irrational is always embedded in the rational. Each one ruptures the other. So it's not possible to really distinguish them in that sense. And so my response would be is that in naming the subaltern, the colonial subaltern as is irrational, of course, what we shouldn't forget is that in the very naming by the colonizer, the colonizer itself is doing a whole bunch of irrational things. So, for example, I mean, the story I really love to tell is the one that Baudrillard actually talks about on the question of the fetish. So the story is that European colonizers went to the west coast of Africa, saw these African natives worshipping idols, and therefore named them fetishists because, you know, they saw them as worshipping kind of mystical, magical things. Yes. And so the subaltern gets named as irrational, as uncivilized, and so on. What Baudrillard points out is that in the very naming, at the very time at which these colonizers were naming Africans as irrational, they were themselves engaging in commodity fetishism. That is what Marx calls a form a form of desire in capitalism, right? They were themselves fetishizing commodities, engaging in trade, and therefore themselves fetishists, right? So I think that's a good example of trying to explain how the rational, the irrational is always embedded within the rational.
Thank you, Ilan. And Françoise.
Yeah, but I see this, I mean, the way, the architecture of accumulated power, the connection with the anti-feminism that arise everywhere in the world. And I would say not just in the far right country, everywhere, in fact. It's not just anti-feminism, it's really something about an economy, a libidinal, I mean, whose libido has to be limitless, cannot find any limit. It has to expand constantly. And if anything that operate as some kind of obstacle to that limitless, to that need to constantly expand is being threatening. And women are part, but not falling into women as better than men. That's not my point at all. It's really go back to the body that has to become the source of depletion and exhaustion also, for the pleasure of the body that feed onto that. So there is an economy that effectively that cannot and feminize everything, feminize insofar as the female body, as the feminized body has to be effectively, has to become a piece of object, a waste, something that can go to waste, that can be wasted. So, but when I say not anti-feminism, because I don't see one feminism, and I see some, some state feminism that will go with that, or corporate feminism that will agree with that. I mean, it's very important, I mean, again, to see that there are women supporting patriarchy and women supporting capitalism, as, again, we have to be careful not to see, as Ilan Kapoor was saying, that the desire to be a member of that class, that group, that community that satisfies itself upon the other is enormous. And if we don't consider that desire and how this desire is being created, we don't understand also what that. So there is, I think there is a war. Yeah, there is a war on life, upon life.
Thank you, Françoise. I think Françoise answered two questions at once, actually. We have another question from Ritu Vij from the University of Aberdeen, and she asks a question to the whole panel, but I think it's from the perspective in particular of Narendran's presentation. She asks the following: storytelling, or we can read narrative politics here, has emerged as a genre of scholarship in international relations that aims to create quote unquote affective spaces on panels, solicit and produce affective community among those engaged in this endeavor. Could the panel speak to the psychic life of storytelling in IR, please? Thank you. Who would like to begin first?
I think
well, I go ahead, Ilan.
No, you should begin first, is what I was saying, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Ritu. Thank you very much. I mean, I think narrative politics, for me, is not a homogeneous or a clearly defined endeavor. I think if I look at what's happening across IR, there's so many varieties that fall under this. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm not sure what its aims are in terms of what it does on panels. And I think we can talk about what kinds of responses, narratives produce in those who listen. I'm always curious about that. But I will say, but I think you have a question here that I think gets at why, right? What's going on here with the narrative turn? And I think for me, what I see is that it allows space for abbreviated subjects, right? Subjectivities to be explored that have otherwise not been allowed into or present in IR. So for example, what it allows me to do is to map a whole, an emotional topography of a failed political struggle, right? In part, but there's more, right? That's not it, but that's the opening, right? So it sort of allows one to get at that, right? That I don't think I can get at in any other way. I don't know if that satisfies you. I'm up for a conversation on this, but I don't see that happening elsewhere, and so that's what it does for me. I hope that's sufficient for now. Thank you for the question.
Ilan.
Well, I mean, I would argue that, yeah, narratives are at the heart of a psychoanalytic perspective. After all, it's about a speaking therapy. What I think what makes psychoanalysis interesting is that it always becomes a dialogical narrative. It's not a monological narrative, which is why I think psychoanalysis can be universalized in that sense, because it always entails a conversation of some kind, but a conversation that aims not only at listening to the narrative, but rather examining it from various perspectives, discovering its gaps, discovering its exclusions, and then perhaps more importantly, identifying the unconscious desires of the narrative, and on both sides of the conversation. So yes, narrative is an essential part of the politics of psychoanalysis.
But in also narrative in psychoanalysis are not just like a flow of things, you know, you got silence, you got constant repetition, you come back and back. So it's not really the storytelling as we understand storytelling, as, you know, it can come back and come back. And so it can be also a lot of repetition, and also the question of and silence. And so the moment of silence perhaps have to be also acknowledged in the process of storytelling, because otherwise we say that and we understand as, you know, a story with a beginning and end, and, you know, like a nice flow.
Thank you, Françoise. Rodrigo, I see that you are about to speak.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the debate on narrative politics in the field of IR, for the reason that I'm not in the field and I'm an interloper here. But I would say that there is a sense in which talking about narrative politics is redundant. I think there is a sense in which any political project, the construction of any political project, of any political movement, has a narrative dimension to it, has a rhetorical and a narrative dimension that, you know, constructs heroes and villains. You know, with neoliberalism, for example, you had your job creators, which is a brilliant ideological construction transforming the boss into the job creator, and then you have, you know, the welfare scroungers, the welfare queens on at the other end. So yeah, I would just point out that in a sense, politics necessarily always involve a narrative dimension.
May I just actually, sorry, very briefly, in fact, tied to Françoise's response to Rodrigo's presentation, and that is the question of repetition is so important as a dimension in psychoanalysis. I mean, that's what Freud calls the death drive, in fact. That we constantly repeat things and never learn as a result, right? And that's what leads to our self-destruction. That's why knowledge is never enough, because we enjoy the repetition. And I think what Rodrigo said about communicative capitalism today is about that, is that you know, Trump can actually make the truth, even though it's a lie, right? And he calls the truth false news, fake news. And perpetuates a lie through repetition constantly. So you can actually create, I mean, this is the politics, the danger of the politics of communicative capitalism is that you make the truth, you actually can make so-called fake news through repetition.
Rahul, did you want to speak to this question or?
Sure, just very quickly thinking about Ritu's question about storytelling, but also Marcello's question about the affective turn in international politics. I would say that I think part of the work for this narrative turn, affective turn, whatever, if that's the language we want to use, is not just, I think, to introduce new stories and new subjectivities into our discussions of international politics, but also to make visible the affective lives of hegemonic narratives, which maybe is a bit like what Rodrigo was saying. In a sense, there have always been stories, and those stories have always had an affective underbelly, which these methods try to make visible by, and in doing so, illuminate what is at stake, what keeps them in place, but also what their points of vulnerability might be, which is exactly what a politics of resistance would want to exploit.
One of my co-organizers, Paulo Chamon, has suggested that I maybe say something quickly about scenes versus narratives. I don't actually want to talk about my own research, but I will say that I'm suspicious of the narrative and that thinking about fantasy in terms of scenes is potentially much more productive. But again, this is not about me, so I will, if you all want to, get in touch with me later, that would be fine. But so we do have a question. I think this is actually different from the one that Rahul mentioned just now from Marcelo, but Marcelo Capucci of IRI asks the following. At IRI, we have a course on monuments, historical heritage, and memory. In the debates held by students about the opposition of vandalism versus repair, one thing is clear: more and more aesthetics and affect are present in the theoretical field of international relations. Do you see this? Oh no, this is the question that you were just addressing. Sorry. Another question that I've received is from João Barcelos, undergraduate student at IRI. This is to Rahul Rao. Which publications, books? Oh no, you've already answered this also. I'm behind the curve. Okay, so Paulo Chamon, one of my co-organizers, asks the following question to Ilan and Françoise. In different ways, you both spoke about the sadistic kick in domination. Is there a sadistic kick in the way domination works? Is there a self-defeating dynamic in our politics of denunciation which actually plays into that sadistic kick? When we say, quote unquote, this makes us suffer structurally, doesn't the structure enjoy? On the other hand, could we speak about the master's need for recognition from the slave and the role of limits, not absolute power in domination? So emphasizing the role of limits, not absolute power in domination. Is there here a way to interrupt the denunciation sadism cycle? So again, this was a complicated psychoanalytically informed question for Ilan and Françoise.
Who's going first?
You go first, Ilan.
Oh, okay. Because I thought there were questions first to Rahul and Rodrigo, so I was thinking maybe they should. Sorry. But since Jimmy is the chair, Jimmy, you should decide.
No, I'm going in the order that they're coming in to me. So that might be different from how they appear in the chat. So, and that's why I was behind the curve on a couple of things that Rahul already answered. So please do speak now about the denunciation sadism cycle.
Yeah, so once again, I mean, my response there is similar to the one I gave earlier, is that the problem with repetition, which by the way is it's not just repetition, but it's the enjoyment of repetition, right? That's the death drive, is that we can never get out of the cycle of, it's very difficult to get out of the cycle of repetition because one enjoys it so much, precisely. And therefore it contains the seeds of its own self-destruction. I mean, continually repeating by not learning from one's own mistakes, leads to self-destruction. I mean, the environmental crisis is it, isn't it? Is that we know the environmental ills that global capitalism brings about, but we continue as if we didn't know, yeah, I mean, which is what Zizek calls the fetishistic disavowal, and that's it. We continue to repeat the mistakes because we actually love. We fetishize capitalism, in other words. So it contains the seeds of its own destruction. And I'm going to orient this actually a little bit to something that Rahul said. And so it's a question from me now, using your question, Paolo. And that is, Rahul, you spoke, I think, about we need to distinguish between the jouissance, the case of the statues of the Dalits versus the new right. I would agree, except that once again, even the jouissance of Dalits needs to face up to the jouissance. Without facing up to the jouissance, it continues to remain in idiotic stupor. A Dalit regime, my bet is that it too may perpetuate a culture of violence, for example, a limited notion of identity based on Dalit identity, and so it contains once again the seeds of its own jouissance. So I'm curious as to why you said one needs to distinguish them and what you would do with that politically.
Just a quick note for as chairs power or whatever. Both Rahul and Ilan may have to actually explain the Dalit statue question, because I think the Dalit question is Dalit is not necessarily a word that we know of here in Brazilian Portuguese, so there might need a little bit of so-called translation, and maybe mention, of course, who the statues are of, which specific figure.
Sure. Shall I maybe address Ilan's question, and in doing so, hopefully also provide some more contextual. So the Dalit movement is the movement of the communities that were formerly described as untouchable in the Hindu caste system. Dalit means broken, and it is a term that has been appropriated and re-signified by Dalits as a term of empowerment. It's a movement whose foremost leader is B.R. Ambedkar, who is also remembered as the architect of India's constitution, because he was the chairperson of the drafting committee of the constitution. And many of the statues that the Dalit movement has built over the past many decades are statues of Ambedkar, built at many scales, very humble representations in village squares to absolutely monumental ones in Lucknow, in the state capital of Uttar Pradesh, for example. So to get to Ilan's question, I think part of what we're seeing in the current moment are a series of, I think, very facile comparisons between, for example, the iconoclasm of Rhodes Must Fall and the iconoclasm of ISIS or the Taliban. So I think one line of critique has to get at what I think is facile about those equations is that they equate movements that are struggling for a toehold in the public sphere and representation that begins to express that, versus movements that are determined to ratify their already existing stranglehold on the public sphere, and the construction of ever more monumental images to ratify that. So if we think about this in terms of how power is distributed in society and how unequal that is, I think we do have to have different attitudes towards these different kinds of statue building projects. In this regard, my position is very different from, say, Ram Guhai, who recently, I think, in a sort of a plague upon both your houses position, said, let's just have a moratorium on statue building, which is, I think, abdicating the responsibility of diagnosing where power lies in society and where it needs to move from and to. Once we live in an equal society, and we're not yet there yet, but once we get there, your point would, I think, absolutely be correct, that those in power would threaten to replicate, to repeat. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Dalit politics is a complex terrain, and there's a very strong tradition that does not seek to replicate Hindu dominance. I mean, the politics of Ambedkar, his conversion to Buddhism, is about pointing to a future in which the Dalit movement does not simply assimilate into a society that is indistinguishable from Hinduism, but actually founds a kind of new revolutionary subjectivity, which, you know, completely breaks with, annihilates caste, but also destroys the scriptural authority of Hinduism. Ambedkar is very categorical about that. So, you know, movements for resistance always face this conundrum. Do we imitate those we oppose, or do we strike out and in a sense deconstruct the very structures on which? That's an old dilemma, and the Dalit movement also confronts it, I think.
Françoise.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question of, you know, the master need for recognition and denunciation as, you know, the sadistic kick. And of course, in denunciation, there is a pleasure, and we see it in social media, and it's need a public. I mean, there is also, again, the scene of lynching, a public lynching. There is really that that we have also to go to this scene of lynching that has to be public. It cannot be, you know, just one person doing that. This is not about, you know, murder of someone by someone. So the scene has to always to be public. And about the recognition, I say that the master needs a public, that nothing is being done in private. It has to have a public. But when we talk about the need for recognition, I introduce the Black female body, or the queer body, or the trans body, because I think it disrupts a little the male to male scene. Because, you know, in the master and slave, there is a male to male scene. And when I talk about even when the male body is feminized, it's also, you know, that there is something disrupting. So in this world of recognition that the master effectively need, and the sadistic kick, and the constant mise en scène of lynchage and domination that needs recognition by effectively the public, the fact that the female body, or the feminized body, I mean, it's this disrupt this scene. And so this is what I was suggesting. And so there is not just the master-slave scene. And in terms of that, I mean, the question when Jimmy was talking about my book on the womb, the fact that also the womb was capitalized, and it's capital under slavery and still today, and that disrupt a little the thing. And again, I'm not saying, you know, the binary man-woman, the binary, I'm just reintroduce the body in the affect and so on, and how the body in that way disrupt this scene in which domination is about really the mise en scène of myself in front of another man, and it's a man-to-man gaze.
So I will move on to the questions again. Thank you all for your answers. We have about 10 minutes left, but we have a number of questions, so I'm going to ask them all at once. And maybe we can do a round of the panel, because I think some of us do have to leave directly at 10 minutes from now. So first question, is actually from Mustafa Pasha by way of Rituvic. So another scholar of IR, senior scholar of IR, he asks the panel as a whole, to what extent does an appeal to jouissance negate the capacity for moral reasoning? A question from Rafael Moscardi of IRI, two questions actually, one to Rodrigo Nunes. There is in your exposition a certain relationship between political affects and cognitive mapping. In particular, how certain simplifications can themselves be a source of comfort and enjoyment and entail a certain compression of complexity. I'd like you to expand in some of the consequences of that, in particular for how we can understand the task of critique itself. And then from Raphael to Ilan, thank you for your exposition. You have worked a lot on the alignment between the circuitries of value production in political economy and their convergence with desire, drive, and the structure of unconscious in psychoanalysis. In this talk in particular, you have hinted at a convergence between nationalism and its libidinal underpinnings as well. What those homologies can mean, what can these homologies mean, particularly for a critique of the nexus between capital, nation, and state in the relation that appears as mutual reinforcement and containment? A question, two more questions, I'm sorry, to overload you all. One from Vitor Costa. Could you give us any clue on how to confront the possible contradictions between narratives in politics and the ontological individualism that comes from neoliberal rationality? I think that must be to the whole panel. And then finally, from Maria Luisa Figueiredo, I'd like to ask about the dangerous practice of movements today that aims to rewrite history. Is it a type of denial of reality? Can we relate these movements with the new generation that treats their own fights as being the most important? And I think that last question is to the whole panel as well, because it wasn't specifically directed. So who would like to begin? I think the first question was to all of you together. Again, the question, what's the relationship? To what extent does an appeal to jouissance negate the capacity for moral reasoning? That's to all of you, I think.
I'll just briefly answer that one, but I feel like I've talked enough, so I want to leave. I don't want to say too much to leave my other fellow panelists time. I think jouissance is the ethics of jouissance is a critique of moral reasoning, I suppose, of what is the good and what is the bad. What is rational and what is the corporeal, and so on and so forth. I think what it does is it forces us to recognize the ugliness within us, the inhumanity within us. And I would go so far as that we need to, that it allows us to come up with a new ethics, what I would call an ethics of the real with a capital R, which is a reference to the unconscious, in that rather than appealing to a politics of morality, we should appeal to a politics of the real. That is, what binds us is not what we have in common, but rather what we share, and that is the ugliness within us, the inhumanity within us. So it's kind of a negative ethics, if you like, that allows, for example, the likes of different positionalities to work together, but in terms of inhumanity, in terms of our shared ugliness, rather than our positive features, our identities, and so on and so forth. I'll stop there.
Does anyone else want to speak to this question? Or should we go to the one for Rodrigo? Okay, so Rodrigo, you were asked is to expand in some of the consequences of your point about how certain simplifications can themselves be a source of comfort and enjoyment and entail a certain compression of complexity. And how is that related to the task of critique itself?
Well, I'll try to answer this quite briefly by focusing on the last part of the question, i.e. the one concerning the task of critique. Well, this again connects to the point about the impossibility of eliminating narrative from politics, but beyond that, the theme that brings us all together here, the impossibility of eliminating affect from politics. So obviously, it would be wrong, it would be pointless, and it would be in contradiction to everything else we're doing here if we opposed to the misinformation and the false narratives of the far right, something that would be a true critical politics or the true cognitive mapping of reality. I think all of us can agree here that some level of compression of complexity will always be inevitable. That you never leave the imaginary entirely. And that's another level in which politics is narrative is precisely the fact that in order to be to become operative, any politics, whether it's reactionary or transformative, must also work from already existing, already established narrative elements with a strong, effective investment for people. So maybe I don't have an answer to the question, but I can propose two ways of rephrasing the question, or two further questions to refine the problem that Rafael posed, which is, the first one would be, how do you transform a critical cognitive mapping into a politics that has the same power of interpolation that the narrative of the far right has? I think this So I think this is one of the big challenges for us. How do we produce a critical cognitive mapping that also has the power to interpolate and to construct effective investment and lends itself to building a movement around it? And how do you build a pedagogical practice of critical cognitive mapping into movement politics? I.e., how is the process of mapping itself, of cognitive mapping itself, a part of movement building? For example, how do you use boycotts, which are usually, people believe that it's just that in order to enact a boycott, all you need to do is post something about it on Twitter and it's going to magically happen. But, you know, whereas Trump could create reality through Twitter, we usually don't have that capacity. We usually don't have that power. How could something like a boycott, for example, be used not only as a political tool, but also as a pedagogical tool of cognitive mapping? So these are problems I don't really have an answer for right now, but I think this definitely gets us in the right track of questions we should be posing, and yeah, problems that we face in transformative political practice today.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I think I want to direct the question about narratives and politics, the possible contradictions between narratives and politics and ontological individualism that comes from neoliberal rationality. I actually like to ask Narendran about that to see if you have thoughts on that, precisely because you're not the one who mentioned neoliberalism or capitalism. So I'm wondering if you have a perspective on ontological individualism, neoliberal rationality, and narratives involved.
Not really, to be honest. I don't think that right. But I mean, I think I don't understand the contradiction between narrative and politics. Maybe that's my problem, that I don't understand the contradiction that's asked in the question. What is the contradiction between politics and narratives?
Yeah, I think maybe it's the contradictions between narratives and politics and the ontological individualism that comes from neoliberal rationality. I think that was how the question was phrased in the way that I received it. No? Okay, so the last question asking about the danger of movements today that aim to rewrite history. Is this a type of the denial of reality? Can we relate these movements with the new generation that treats their own fights as being the most important? Is there a kind of narcissism, perhaps, to add an extra word to the question? And this was not directed at anyone. So is there a kind of rewriting of history, a denial of history, and perhaps a narcissism? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I could say a couple of things. The past is not a stable object. In that sense, it cannot be described as a kind of static reality, the story of which remains the same. The stories we tell about the past are going to change all the time, and they're going to change either because we discover new things about the past that we didn't know, or because we ask new questions about the past that we didn't ask before, or because the moral and political values of our communities have changed as a result of social justice movements and upheaval, which means that we have new moral attitudes towards things that we always knew happened, but that we now revisit in a different way, precisely because of the ways in which our own values have changed. That doesn't mean that the past is entirely about projecting presentist values and preoccupations onto another time, because the past also leaves behind material traces, and those traces constrain the reinterpretations that we can place on them. But there's Paul Ricoeur, I think, talks about this. There's a sort of two-way temporality here. The past leaves behind traces that constrain the meanings we can place on the past, but we are also reading those traces through the preoccupations of the present. And so that connection between the past and present means that the stories we tell about the past are always going to change.
Thank you. Françoise, I know that you wanted to jump in, and then after Françoise, Narendran.
Yeah, no, just I want to go back to the question of reason and jouissance, and I agree with Ilan about, the sheer ugliness, but I wanted to know, and I don't think that reason can enter that, no jouissance, but what do we do with the kind of unleashed violence, that we witness, or, the incredible death drive that is, today, going on today. And then to the question of, what do we have libidinal alternative to the jouissance of that capitalism, racism, and sexism offer? Well, I think we have also to admit that there is an incredible intensity that this, gave. I mean, there's incredible that there is even, when you read narrative by soldiers or the, committing massacres or whatever, they tell you of an incredible intensity of feeling of an incredible, like getting drunk, but in the good ways, I mean, the good way for them. I mean, there is incredible. And so that intensity, I mean, we have never resolved the question of intensity, because then we offer peacefulness and is not a kind of boredom in a way, it's not going to get bored, in this quiet life of, with, and so I do think that this question of intensity has to be answered, and what kind of, peacefulness and will also fulfill the desire for some kind of, I mean, there is a call for intensity. I wanted to say that. And also for the new generation, I absolutely agree with Rahul. And and also the fact that, thank God, we have constant conflict about, how we understand an event and what it's going on. I mean, and it's new. And what we see today, what I see here in France, for instance, is this kind of constant rehearsal of a hold, I mean, something that has to be fixed, that has to be, I mean, that has also, that there is an investment, a really psychic investment in something which is fixed and which is being disturbed by this, alternative narrative. And what is effectively perhaps what Rahul was saying with a statue, I mean, the investment in that I remember we were in front of the Gallieni statue in Paris, and we were doing some performance, interesting performance, and two young men arrived, and they were crying. They were crying, really, I mean, white, totally conservative and so on, but at the same time, absolutely crying because we were mocking. We were not destroyed, not vandalized, we were mocking Gallieni, and this absolutely disturbed deeply their sense of being the young boys of the French state. And again, it was nonetheless a lot of masculinity being invested in that. I mean, some also. So this is what I just wanted to add.
Thank you, Darren.
I'll keep this quick. I mean, the question and Rahul's response both made me think of the difference between history and historicism. I mean, history as past. And I wonder whether we also have to think about how historicism is a particular way of constructing the past and how that has become so important, right, to politics and to the construction of the self, as opposed to other modes of constructing the past. And so I think for me, the question also becomes, what constructions of the past are in play? Are these contestations between historicist constructions themselves, or are there other constructions, right, versus historicist constructions? So that's, I think, also of importance, I think, for me.
Any last words from our panelists?
Just very, very briefly on tying a couple of things and a couple of other questions. It seems to me that the left has a lot to learn from the right on the question of desire, because the right has been much more successful in exploiting, redirecting desire, the kind of passion that you, well, we know in Brazil, you're all aware of the incredible passion of the right and pursuing, and Trump and so on and so forth, pursuing goals that defy logic, but nonetheless, that I think the left can learn from. Part of the problem with the left is that it constantly, it's always compromising its desire, which is why we end up with some kind of welfarist capitalism, right? It seems to me that the left needs to learn how to inhabit the drive, the relentlessness and intensity that Françoise was talking about. That's the lesson for the left, is how do we stick to our desire for a post-capitalist alternative without compromising our desire?
Anyone else from the panel? Just to make me a quick note, this is not about me and how I think of things, but it is funny that that in a way these are questions that are very old. We think of the new right as very new, and the affects of the new right as new. But one book that was very influential to the mentor that Françoise and I have in common, Michael Rogan, was a set of books, actually. Klaus Thevelite's Male Fantasies, which was a study of affect, psychoanalysis, desire, violence in National Socialism, right? It was a 2-volume work that I think people don't cite anymore, but I think is maybe worth a look again, so that we can think of how the affects, the masculine affects of the new right are actually in some ways reproductions, repetitions. So maybe we should all have a 300-person reading group on Klaus Stadolite. But anyway, I want to thank the panelists. It was a wonderful, very quick, I feel like I can't even believe it's been 2 hours. Some of you will be speaking again, but I very much want to thank this particular conjuncture of Ilan, Françoise, Rahul, Narendran, I keep calling him by the shortened name, and Rodrigo. It was fantastic, I feel like we've been through a lot very quickly, and I want it to go on longer, even though my dog here is very, very restless and needs some attention right now. But some of you will be back. I hope that those of you who will not be speaking again will be joining us for some of the other panels, so that we can have more exchanges among panelists as well. And again, thank you to the logistical part of it. I thank you again to the simultaneous translators who, I was listening in English, but I know that you all have worked very hard to try and keep up with some very fast speakers, including myself. And again, the logistical part, the staff at Erie, who have compiled the questions and who have also taken care of the more technological part. So thank you to them. And again, thank you to my fellow organizers and the panelists for today. It was wonderful. Applause. So please join us tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a panel on populisms and insurgencies and affect. And then again, we will continue this voyage through various questions of the psychic life of international politics over the course of the week. So please do come back. And again, I thank you and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you happen to be.